Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Type Directors Club. The salon today, we're so excited to be back on screen again with everyone. I'm Carol Waller. I'm the Executive Director. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Kudos, who will introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Kudos. I am the advisory board member at the TDC. I am very happy to welcome two amazing individuals here, Tiffany Pai and Jennifer Kinon. I will just, hi everyone. Today the topic is Lotus, which is a magazine that is Tiffany had put together for her thesis project. I'm gonna do some formality here, just reading bios about Tiffany, okay? So Tiffany Pai is a Chinese-American illustrator and designer. She graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design with a BFA in illustration and recently finished the MFA Design program at the School of Visual Arts. She's currently freelancing as designer on the brand identity team at the New York Times. Also joining us today is Tiffany's thesis mentor, Jennifer Kinon, founding partner of Champions Design in New York. She is also the faculty member of School of Visual Arts MFA Design program and is president emeritus of AIGA New York. So Tiffany, take it away.
Also, Jennifer,
I'm going to take it away.
Start with the intro. Yeah.
I'm going to take it away. I get to do the Tiffany introduction today, and I'm very glad for that opportunity. So, hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Kinon. I'm co-founder of Champions Design here in New York City. I am very excited to get to take some time out this afternoon to talk about Tiffany and to listen to her talk about her thesis project. In addition to my work at Champions Design, I have been a longtime instructor at the School of Visual Arts graduate program. That's a program headed by Steve Heller and Lita Tallarico. It's been around since I think about 2000. It started out as designer as author, and it has evolved into a program called the Designer as Entrepreneur. And it's a 2-year program with just 4 semesters. For 3 of those semesters, the students are working on a product. That is their thesis assignment. That is the whole purpose of this program, is to really teach designers how they don't have to wait around for clients, but they can step up and be their own clients and do their own thinking and put their own products out into the world with just a little bit of support, with a little bit of support from legal, a little bit of support from product development, and a little bit of support from community. And that's really what SVA MFA Design provides. And that's the community that I've gotten to be a part of for so many years. Now, last year was really remarkable in its existence to get to be a part of this community when it went entirely virtual was a totally different experience. And to be virtual in a time of pandemic and in a time where social justice was such a core focus through the election, through the murder of George Floyd, and through all the repercussions through the AAPI community of COVID was an extraordinary experience. Because as a teacher, you are working with these students that are dealing with life, just dealing with life, dealing with the news, dealing with figuring out how to be a student in New York City, how to get through the day as a graduate student, and also get through all the muck and all the challenge of just living as a human being with all of these conditions all happening at the same time. And what you really cling to as a teacher is, that student, the one that shows up every day with the big questions, the one that shows up every day ready to tackle the big challenges. And for me, teaching, that was Tiffany. That was Tiffany every day in, day out, showing up, trying to figure out, okay, how does my place in the world affect the world? How does the work I do affect the work that everyone else is doing? How does my fight amplify the fight that this country is going through, that my community is going through? And how can I push myself every day to really deal with what's happening? And what people don't talk about very much in thesis programs is almost the hardest part about the program is deciding what your thesis is going to be. It's blue sky. So the assignment is, pick your own thesis topic. And as designers, we're often like doctors. It's like, give us a body to operate on and we'll come in and fix it. But when someone says, like, imagine the problem, go find your own body, like go do anything. We're not built that way. And so one of the biggest challenges as an instructor in the SVA program is bringing the students through the process of deciding what their project is going to be. And in a moment like we just went through, with social justice at the forefront, with a big election, with COVID, with the challenge of digital learning, you often see students try to weigh, what you can handle emotionally against what you can handle academically. And what was really amazing was to see Tiffany make the choice to lean in. Tiffany really made the choice to, I'm dealing with this every day and I'm just going to really deal with it. I'm going to deal with it when I'm doing my work. I'm going to deal with it when I'm looking at the news. I'm going to deal with it when I'm looking down the street, and I'm just going to figure out how to bring all these parts of my life together and how to use my design and how to use my intelligence and how to use my insight to really affect the change that I want to see in the world, the change that I want to be in the world. And so I was just so excited when I was given the opportunity to work with her as her thesis advisor. I learned so much from her in class, just to have the opportunity to support her day by day. Really, all I did was tell her how brilliant she was and hand her the phone number to anybody I knew that could support her in her work, and then learn as we went about how I could be a better ally in this fight and how I can support just the brilliance of the next generation of designers. And that's a really new experience for me. I feel like I'm moving through my career as all these new students are coming through the program, and seeing the next generations rise is really exciting. And so I think today's opportunity, brought to us by John Kudos, who was sitting in on the thesis forum. I'm just so grateful that John got to hear this thesis presentation and saw it for what it is, brought it to the TDC, and the TDC in this moment understood that giving a student the platform, giving a student the microphone is really how we're going to see what the future is going to be like and how we can all just sit here and listen. And so I'm so proud to introduce Tiffany. I'm so excited to introduce Tiffany. I hope everybody wants to hear this presentation. And so I'm really glad that it's being recorded and can be passed on to the future, because this bravery, this excitement is what is going to move design forward and help change the world. So without further ado, here's Tiffany.
Well, thank you so much for the intro, Jennifer. All right, here we go.
Beautiful.
Thanks again for the intro, Jennifer. It was a real pleasure and real honor to get to work with Jennifer throughout this process. And as Jennifer mentioned, I'm currently working on the brand identity team at the New York Times. And I've personally always really been very passionate about politics. And I think that Jennifer's work with Champions and the Hillary campaign has really demonstrated that design has a massive role to play in this political landscape. So at 2019, at the very start of the program, I was set on actually doing a thesis project on bipartisanship. And then we witnessed the last days of the Trump presidency and this overall increase in cultural intolerance. And I knew I still wanted to make a political thesis, but bipartisanship just no longer felt right to me. At each milestone of the thesis process, there were always brand new, horrific examples of anti-Asian violence to show. Under Trump, hate crimes against Asian Americans skyrocketed. We bought pepper spray, we avoided the subway, and we feared for our lives. But at the same time, this new generation of Asian American politicians and celebrities are finding their voices and using them to demand better representation. Senator Cory Booker even called Asian America this sleeping giant in American politics about to wake up. So we're the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the US electorate, actually. But we remain underrepresented in major areas of American life, especially in politics, especially in film. And I think that design, along with other visual creative forms, is a key arena in addressing this balance. And the razor thin margins of the 2020 election demonstrated that Asian American votes have never been so critical. We turned out in record numbers in 2020, and we really are at a defining moment for Asian America. So I think with this moment, with this rising violence, coupled with this growing visibility of prominent Asian Americans' needs, is really this new wave of Asian American politics in a unified political movement. So for my thesis, I specifically wanted to focus on how we raise the next generation of Asian American activists and leaders. What could be a designed focal point for raising the political consciousness of the next generation? So before we talk about the next generation, I wanted to bring it back to the past. Historically, magazines have actually been a rallying point for Asian American communities. These early magazines have all since folded. But you might notice that these magazines talk about pop culture, they focus a lot on celebrity, and the way they all tend to look, perhaps with the exception of Yolk, is that they look like mass circulation magazines of the day, so something like Vogue or InStyle. You might also notice that some of the topics discussed here are largely still the same ones being discussed today. And I think this is in part because most of these magazines were never very widely circulated, and also that Asian American issues really haven't been at the forefront of the American national consciousness until fairly recently. And these magazines were doing some really amazing, interesting things. But regardless, these early magazines have been key to establishing what we think of as this Asian American identity. And Asian American magazines continue to the present, although they're mostly cultural focused, with magazines like Slanted, Banana Mag, and Kajal still pushing at the boundaries of what it means to be Asian American. And outside of Asian America, of course, the magazine itself had such a long history rooted in protest and political movements. And I'm sure you could probably name, no matter where you come from, and perhaps especially in this crowd as designers and artists, a publication that has been influential in the politics of your homeland or your community, which brings me on to Lotus, which is a quarterly political publication by and for Asian American youth. And by youth, I mean raised in the States, ages 18 to 30, and budding in their political awareness. And it's through advocating for civic and political engagement that I think we plant an unequivocal flag of belonging. So an issue of Lotus is divided into 4 segments: politics, spotlight, arts and culture, and homework. So the editor's note starts each issue by introducing the theme of the issue and acknowledging recent events. I worked with a pool of really talented young Asian American writers, photographers, and illustrators. So I started with the politics section. I think by even including a politics section, it's staking a place of belonging. Politics is not a space that Asian Americans have traditionally belonged in or felt welcomed in. So here, in Is Representation Enough? We have 2 writers that question the place of identity politics in evaluating the rising star of Kamala Harris and Andrew Yang. I also interviewed API Coalition Director of the Georgia Democrats, Lynn Nguyen, on what Georgia meant for this community and also how to get into her line of work. In Spotlight, I aim to feature young Asian American activists. Here I featured Harvey Humphrey, whose political awareness and journey to activism started with this extraordinary but tragic story. His parents were actually taken by the Chinese Communist Party when he was 18. And this led him to reflect on the importance and the fragility of the rule of law. And in arts and culture, I hope to feature artists who are contributing to the visual vocabulary of Asian America. So in this issue, I featured 2 artists who are using their skills to aid Manhattan's Chinatown. Designer Fei Chu, who actually works for John at Kudos now, and illustrator Zarula Bao. I also aim to inject moments of levity throughout. So here we have a little comic by Jean Wei that kind of recognizes the frustrations of the moment in a humorous way. I also wanted to end each issue with a call to action. So the homework section really details what to read, what to listen, what to watch, what to donate, and where to show up. With the last page kind of summarizing all of the organizations mentioned in the issue and how to get involved with them. But what I really want to discuss today is how I came to the visual identity of Lotus. In creating a new magazine for Asian America focused on politics, I was really putting forward my vision for what a unified Asian American political movement could, perhaps should, looks like in terms of design. And to even reach a point of view on that, I felt like I had to answer some pretty big questions. So these magazines that I brought up before, I think open up a conversation for us about what the visual design of Asian Americans should look like. And in my quest to answer this question, I needed to answer some much, much bigger questions. So who is Asian America? What is our place in the country? How are we portrayed? And how do we portray ourselves? So I'll explore each of these questions now, along with the design ramifications that come from answering each of them. So the first one, in order to even discuss design in connection with Asian America, I think we need to get on the same page about who we actually mean when we say Asian America. And this isn't actually a straightforward answer. So the term Asian America was started by a Japanese American activist named Yuji Ichioka in 1968 as part of the civil rights movement in the West Coast in UC Berkeley. And this was actually a conscious effort to create this unified Asian American identity. So prior to this, Asian Americans were largely thought of as distinct and separate ethnic groups. So you would think of someone as Japanese or Chinese or Indian, but never as Asian America. Actually, before that, even the term Oriental was used, which is now widely recognized as a slur. And this move to create this Asian American solidarity actually came in tandem with the work of Black civil rights leaders. So a common term that you've probably heard of quite a lot is AAPI, which stands for Asian American and Pacific Islander. However, there has been a lot of debate, especially recently, around the usefulness of this blanket term because it encompasses South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and all of the Pacific Islands. And that's a massive geographic block with no shared religion, no common language, and not one dominant culture. Also, many Laotian, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Hmong immigrants came as refugees, while a lot of Taiwanese and Indian immigrants came later as part of this wave of skilled labor. So South Asians also face colorism and Islamophobia in a way that East Asians do not, which leads to this term East Asian privilege, which also comes out of this East Asian dominance in these conversations about Asian America, as well as this relative social and economic prosperity East Asians have enjoyed. So the current makeup of Asian America has been fundamentally shaped by decades of racist immigration policies. Almost all Asian countries have had some sort of exclusionary policy leveled against them. The majority of current Asian American immigrants actually came after the 90s, when these immigration policies shifted and started favoring skilled labor. So there is this kind of disconnect between the generation that really was associated with this Asian American civil rights movement and newer arrivals. currently, I think still a lot of Asian Americans would identify as Japanese American, Thai American, Indian American before identifying themselves perhaps as Asian American. So in many ways, this term Asian American is a political one. It's a term that was both imposed upon us and also chosen by us as a community. And like before, as mentioned before, Pacific Islanders were grouped into this category. And people have argued that this increases visibility and support for Pacific Islanders, but you could also argue the other way, that this actually leads to their erasure, as you really see in this tweet. There have also been recent debates on who gets to be called Asian American, who this term applies to. So is it all Asians in America? Is it any of Asian American descent born in America? Anyone who naturalized? Even without, and then there's the question of citizenship. So based on my research, I developed this personal design principle of being very intentional about who you want to include. So how specific or inclusive should you be? Are you actually designing for all of Asian America or a specific subgroup of Asian Americans? So if you use an Asian pattern, such as this one, which is actually distinctly Japanese, it's not really speaking to Filipino, Vietnamese, or Indian Americans. Which leads me on to why I chose the name Lotus, because it doesn't come from one specific Asian culture. It actually has this significance in multiple Asian cultures with associations of rebirth, resurrection, because it's a flower that grows out of the mud. And on a personal note, I was actually drawn to this name because it has these kitsch associations in Western culture. And I thought this could perhaps be an attempt to reclaim that. And I also knew I wanted to represent a full slate of East Asian, Southeast Asian, and South Asian stories. But at the same time, this research made me wary of using the term AAPI in connection with my thesis, and to be really intentional when using this term in general. So I chose to use Asian American because I personally did not feel like I could accurately portray Pacific Islander issues. I didn't want to claim to do so. And the next question I had is, what is our place in this country? So how does America see us? So historically, we've been portrayed as the Dragon Lady, Madam Butterfly, Fu Manchu, Apu, Me Love You Long Time, Long Dak Dong, Mr. Yunioshi. Simultaneously hypersexual and also completely desexualized. Docile, but also threatening. The butt of the joke, but also this existential threat to Western civilization. And this really reflects our odd place in America's racial hierarchy. In her seminal essay called The Racial Triangulation of Asian Americans, Claire Jean Kim argues that while Asian Americans are at once valorized against Blacks, we're deemed unassimilable foreign. We're never deemed fully American. And we see this reflected in so many ways, from lack of political representation to the layered conversations around affirmative action in college admissions, and even to everyday interactions of like, your English is so good, where are you from? Go back to where you're from. And at this time, I was hearing calls by multiple professors to translate my magazine into various Asian languages. But knowing what we just talked about this perpetual foreignness, it made me doubly sure that I didn't want to translate, and I wanted to avoid reinforcing foreignness of any kind. My mother has actually never voted in any American election, despite being an American citizen for over 20, 25 years. And she cited the reason as never feeling American enough. She never felt welcomed or entitled to civic participation. So this quote by Michael Rock, who is a founding partner of 2x4, really, really stuck with me. And he talks about design creating stories and solidifying the boundaries of what we recognize as true. So I think design has the power to define the boundaries of belonging as much as it has the power to alienate. And I wanted to design this world where it was a given that Asian Americans belonged in this space, politics, that we traditionally have not belonged in. So I created this pull-out poster detailing all of the jobs in the House, the Senate, so the legislative, executive, judicial branches of government, but from the point of view of how to get these jobs. And my interest in highlighting the work of both established Asian American activists like Lin Nguyen, who I mentioned, and younger activists like Harvey also stems from this desire to normalize civic engagement, even at very varying levels. With someone like Lin, who's worked with the likes of Eric Adams, Cory Booker, to someone like Harvey, who isn't, who canvassed in a swing state, and civic engagement is really something he does on the side and not his job. And that's also why I created the homework section, which point to tangible ways of getting involved. And this is all to signal that you belong in the space too. So now that we have an idea of where we stand in this country, my question was, how are we actually portrayed in American visual culture? So I'm sure all of you have seen this. This is an iconic piece of design associated with Chinese or a general East Asian culture in America. And I think it's in the world of type, I think it really is this elephant in the room. When you see this, the associations have traditionally been cheap, unhealthy, dirty, bad for you. And this really comes from this wonton type or chopstick type, which is available from Da Font. And it's really stuck in the national consciousness. It's an entirely Western phenomenon. And it has been employed by many Chinese American establishments as this visual shorthand to signify Asianness. And I think it's a typeface that really reflects our national attitude towards Asia. It blends East Asian cultures in a casually racist remix that signifies an exotic, primitive, and monolithic other. Now, I think there's nothing inherently wrong with attempting to mirror the stroke of Chinese characters in a Latin alphabet. But I think it's the history behind this that really makes it so insidious. It's historically been associated with this idea of the yellow peril, which is the idea that the East exists as this diametrically opposed, existential, all-encompassing threat to Western civilization. And I think that idea is really at the root of this poster. If you really look at it, which is a monstrous Japanese man waiting to end your civilization if you misplace your tools. And this idea of yellow peril is actually invented to justify the European efforts to colonize China. And then we saw it reapplied to galvanize anti-Japanese sentiment during World War II. We still see this typeface employed in contemporary design. Abercrombie & Fitch used it in a series of t-shirts in 2002. We saw Fresh Direct use it in their packaging in 2012. And now, very recently, Archery World in their social media posts in 2021. In the case of Fresh Direct, they actually had a whole conversation with their own design team and came to the conclusion that using any other normal typeface would have been too Western. And in terms of my approach to type at Lotus, I looked at this hand-drawn logo for the logo mark, which has a lot of energy and references the visual language of protest posters. And I think it really speaks to youth. And I paired this with a more classic type choice, so Nib Pro for a display type by Colophon, Tiempo's text for the body text, and Founders Grotesque, both by Klim. And none of this was to signify Asianness in any way, which brings me on to my next point, contemporary portrayals of yellow peril. And I think these are much less obvious than the ones we've seen before. But because Asian Americans as a group were seen as perpetual foreigners, American attitudes towards Asian Americans really are shaped by portrayals of Asia. We saw this during World War II when Japanese Americans were incarcerated unjustly for the actions of Imperial Japan, but not German Americans for the decisions of Nazi Germany. And I think recent spikes in anti-Asian sentiment have really raised questions on how we portray China. You see this dragon as a recurring motif. It paints China as an alien, monstrous, all-encompassing threat to the West. Not to say that the Chinese government isn't a threat to the States, but as Asian Americans, we're so often seen as an interchangeable monolith. These associations affect us all. And illustrator Jen Liv actually posted about her discomfort about being given these assignments. So I think this one is on us. We're the people commissioning and creating the work. And I think it begs the question of what level of responsibility we ourselves want to assume for creating and commissioning work like this. So this leads me on to my third design principle, which is no stereotyping. It feels like a must. I think imagery should always be given special sensitivity. So here I want to talk about our cover illustration. And I worked on this with Taiwanese American illustrator David Huang, who's actually here, to create this. He's incredibly talented. And here's some of the early sketches. We focused on the theme of little things coming together to create something new and great. I really love this piece. I think it's incredibly vibrant and it bursts with life and energy. But we also had a conversation about whether or not this illustration needed to feel explicitly Asian. And we just felt like we didn't need to. I feel like this quote unquote Asianness comes from David's style, which is really a reflection of his authentic heritage and his lived experience. With that said, we did end up incorporating and signaling Asianness in a more subtle and considered way. So in these flowers, you actually see flowers that are significant to different Asian cultures. So chrysanthemums, jasmines, the lotus. And I wanted to double back on this article. As a reminder, this article is about an activist Harvey's journey, which starts with the traumatizing imprisonment of his parents by the Chinese Communist Party. So here, instead of portraying an image of what I think is perhaps the obvious one, a Chinese dragon wrapping around his parents, I worked with the illustrator, Ho Kyung Kim, to portray the act of his parents being taken, and then paralleled it with Harvey knocking on the door of a Republican while canvassing. I felt like this spoke to the psychological loneliness and his personal experience, and it really frames this article as a personal journey. So caricaturing and stereotyping in imagery feels like, to me, more often than not, the lowest common denominator. Is there always a need to overtly signifying Asianness when you could hire one of many talented Asian illustrators that have developed styles authentic to their history and their own lived experience? I truly don't think there is a substitute for that intangible quality. So how do we choose to portray ourselves? I started by looking at work in the cultural space centered around Asian American youth. So musicians, podcasts, magazines. And I think there's this common theme of energy created by vivid colors, playful and custom type. But sometimes veers into the appropriation of Black culture. Additionally, I think work by and for an Asian American audience has the luxury of not needing to explain itself for a non-Asian audience. And you see it here in these visual in-jokes that play on stereotypes. And I think this all lends an unapologetic quality to the work. I also looked at Asian American nonprofits and political organizations. And for the most part, I think there's a distinct lack of culturally specific signaling, be it in the icons, patterns, or color. There's instead this immediate signaling of institutional legitimacy. This looks less Asian, perhaps with the exception of the Asian American Federation, and more like an institution. And I think there's a real balance to be struck in between this galvanizing energy and excitement of cultural work, but also this legitimizing clarity of the nonprofit work. And I actually think this is something that Bobby and Jennifer at Champions do particularly well. And before I landed where I landed with Lotus, I had actually explored a couple of different directions with naming and brand that really centered around this idea of cool. And I went pretty far down this direction. And I felt like my motivations for creating this work was really stemming from a desire to prove that I was a cool, edgy, trending designer. Like, look how smart I am, like this name I am, like it's very clever. And I went pretty far down this direction. I thought I could do some fun things with ligature of US in Lotus, which references us as a group and United States. And what if I use that ligature as a core part of the brand expression? And I carried this focus onto cool into this verbal identity as well. But at some point, I realized with the help of Jennifer that I was really designing for other designers. And this identity and direction was really about proving that I was a good designer, that you could see like the thought that went into the ligature of us, and look how cool it all seems. But I felt that I need to get back to being fundamentally inclusive and joyful. So I've actually currently put Lotus on hold, but I've taken the learnings from Lotus and applied it to another, perhaps higher stakes project that for me actually felt like the culmination of all of these questions and all of these learnings from my thesis. While doing the thesis, Jennifer had introduced me to this organization called Run AAPI. And I was actually asked by Run AAPI to design and brand the Biden administration's AAPI inaugural event. And we were asked to do this in a weekend, so we had no time. And I thankfully got to work with my really talented friends and classmates, Rohan Regay, Renee Freja, and Chao Chin Wang. So the identity for the event needed to feel celebratory and inclusive because it really was AAPI. But the design process started with the client asking us to reference these vintage Chinese stamps, which you see on the right, to mirror the seal of the Biden administration. But knowing what we now know about inclusivity within the space, it didn't feel right to put this logo distinctly inspired by a piece of Chinese culture on top of the likes of Vice President Harris, Kumail Nanjiani, and Japanese breakfast. So instead, we came up with this geometric mark and identity system based upon this mark. It doesn't have direct roots in one specific Asian visual culture, but I think there's a lot of energy in the negative space of the mark. And we extended this geometric pattern beyond the seal and really grounded the identity within this. This type directors club, I feel obligated to comment on the type we chose. And we chose this mix of serifs and sans serifs that are actually Google fonts because we didn't have the budget to pay for a type. And again, this type choice doesn't signify Asianness in any way. But I think this was a nice balance between what I was talking about in terms of this youthful energy and this kind of feeling of being of the moment, but also institutional legitimacy. And we used this mark and this geometric, in this warm, energetic color palette and this animation that Rohan did that plays off this mark's rotational symmetry. We even got to see it on Vice President Harris, which was an incredibly humbling moment and also very surreal. So thank you for listening to me. And I really hope that these learnings from my thesis project have sparked some ideas with you in how we as cultural tastemakers approach designing for Asian America. Thank you so much.
Yay.
That was great. Sorry, I was trying to get my video on. Yeah, we have a lot of cheers from the audience here as you were presenting. And I mean, before I go through the questions, I just want to share that, that was a really good history lesson. I think this is one of the things that struck out to me when I was, watching your thesis presentation at the MFA Design program, that so much research went into it. And it's even more revealing to me that you actually ditched that initial approach that you had. That was a big move. So I want to maybe follow with this question from Ashley Wu. Actually, since you went so far down with that cool direction for Lotus, was it difficult to kill the design?
I think yes and no. I think my initial, but actually before working with Jennifer and before picking a thesis advisor, my kind of initial gut reaction to bringing politics closer to like youth culture was that it needed to be cool, it needed to be trendy. And it was really after doing all of this research, after talking to Jennifer, that it suddenly became very obvious. I'm like, wait, where is this coming from? Like this really did stem from my desire to want to create something really cool, a really nice portfolio piece. So I can say, hey, look at this ligature, like, yeah. And I had this conversation with Jennifer and she was like, is cool part of your brand? I was like, oh, of course. Wait, that's it. That really is it. So I felt like that was like, I think Jennifer has a way of just getting to the point without it being like offensive or anything, but it just felt really obvious after that.
I think, Jennifer, I'm going to wait for you to respond to that now.
Well, I think what we all got to hear today is the tremendous research Tiffany did in preparation for her work here. and the way that she synthesized it into a really meaningful strategy. And as her advisor, I think all I had to do is keep reminding her of her own brilliance. Just that you did this research, you put this strategy together, make sure that that's what you're designing for. Make sure you're not going off, I think that's the trick. I think when you're a really great designer, you can make anything. There's no rules, there's no boundaries. And so to really bind yourself into your strategy is what the trick is. That's how you really serve your audience, and that's how you really serve your subject. And so Tiffany did the work on the research, Tiffany did the work on the strategy, and all she needed to do is be reminded of that as she did the design work. And it's hard when you're a student, and it's hard when you're a young designer, because every single piece feels so precious. And it feels like, oh, this is the one that's going to get me that job. This is the one that's going to get me to the next place in my career. But if you got to keep reminding yourself that it's not the style that's going to do it, it's the function, it's the service, it's the outcome. And I think that's what really got Lotus to this point and has gotten the recognition that it has, is because it's so meaningful in its strategy and it's so meaningful in its implementation. And that Tiffany was able to go that far and come back to it is just a testament to her commitment to the outcome she wants to see in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I also think, designing for designers is the very common trap, right? Because we draw inspiration from other designers, we follow other designers, and oftentimes it just makes it way to the client's work, So I think this is actually, because it's political, because it matters so much, I think I love that you have the heart to actually drop everything, just gonna, approach it from a different angle. So can you actually buy a physical copy of Lotus? I know you discontinued it, but I mean...
I was actually looking for and working with an editor to really get the copy to where I wanted it to be, but some things fell through. So currently I've tabled it, unfortunately. But if you're interested in collaborating or funding, we could have.
If anybody knows grant makers or funders or anything, send
yes.
them.
Yes. So we'll publish the video and let's blast it to everyone.
Let's get actually made.
On the note of cool, especially in the context of Asian American visual culture, was actually this group called the Sad Asian Girls, who got a lot of press. They were two girls in the graphic design program at RISD, and I think they did some really provocative things. And they created this kind of project that was really centered on this idea of the rebellious Asian girl. They're really highlighting a lot of East Asian women who dressed a certain way, who were really cool, winged eyeliner, wear a lot of black. And I think the project raised a lot of interesting questions, but it actually ended up not working out for them. And in their own reflections, they had talked about how they went so far down pursuing this aesthetic of cool that it alienated a lot of people that didn't wear a lot of black, didn't have a lot of piercings, didn't wear winged eyeliner. So that was actually something in the back of my head. And I think what they did was amazing, but I think, reading their reflections, that really made me think about how we approach designing for politics, for campaigns. Maybe cool isn't always the right way to go. Yeah.
I think that's for all of us to decide. So I have a few really good questions here. How was the collaboration process with working alongside so many contributors? Was there anything you learned specifically from the Lotus project? Were there unexpected difficulties, or was it smooth?
So for the first question, I think working with, there's a mix of people that I had worked with already who were friends who I knew, and people who I didn't know at all. David, I think I want to shout out, was such a joy to work with. And I think because we've known each other, we went to school together, we were able to be really honest with each other and have very open conversations about like, hey, does this piece of illustration need to feel Asian? And I think that's something you don't always have the kind of comfort. And I think that's kudos to him for asking that question. And that's something I think is worth asking about always. And it was honestly such a joy to be able to commission something and have a loose idea of what you want, and to get back something brilliant and beautiful. And I think that's inherently the joy of art direction as a career. In terms of difficulties, I think it was actually really difficult for me to get to a point where I felt comfortable saying, no, I don't want to translate this magazine. No, I don't want to use this like Chinese framing device. Because those were the conversations that the crits I was getting from the rest of my professors in the program, which was, oh, shouldn't you translate? Oh, this doesn't look Asian enough. Like, and which isn't perhaps their fault for thinking that way, but yeah, it took a while to get to the point of being like, actually, no.
Okay. Did people approach you with story ideas to be published in Lotus, or did you go in and search the stories yourself?
So I kind of drove this in terms of stories that felt like were waiting to be told. Specifically with the Harvey piece. Harvey is someone, he's one of my classmates, and I had watched him grow into someone who was really politically active, really civically engaged. And I knew there was this very traumatic event that happened in his life. And it was a real, I felt, I was really scared to ask if he'd be willing to write about it, or willing to talk about it, and to his credit, he did.
Okay, I'm gonna read one last question. I think this may be the most difficult one, but I think it's worth discussing. This is from Brad McKenzie. I really like how you balance the inclusivity of the group with the differences within the group. You encompassed Asian culture without leaning towards, say, a Chinese or Japanese or Laotian aesthetic. From your experience, what tips would you offer to designers to avoid having a mushy middle be mushy at all?
I mean, I think this is a question I think about quite a bit. I feel like the first question is, how inclusive is this meant to be? Who's your audience? I think it's a very different question if you are, when you're designing for an Asian audience, there's a lot of like shorthand. There's a lot of like, it is what it is. And you can get away with visual jokes. It's very different, I guess, for a mass circulation wide audience. And I think it's really the intention behind it. Do you really need to signify Asianness? I think is a big question. And I think about it quite a lot, especially with I think the Spotify AAPI Heritage Month campaigns have actually been a really interesting place. I think there was 1 year, 2 years ago, where they used this beautiful Chinese frame as this device for all of these artists. And that one really struck me because you were putting this on like Pacific Islander artists, Indian artists. It just didn't feel quite right to me. And it was tiny element, but really, really stuck out to me. And I think this year they went on a very different approach where they were using lotus flowers that were like generated and these patterns, but it didn't feel specific, and it still felt really vibrant, tons of energy, but there wasn't that specific visual point that I could point to and be like, oh, actually, no, that's an Indian pattern. Actually, no, that's a Chinese pattern. And I felt like there's a lot to be said in that.
I think that's the last question. So I want to thank you both for doing this. I know this is, everyone's time so precious, and we have always like 5 too many Zoom calls a day, right? So I really want to thank you for this. Carol, do you have any closing announcement?
Thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I wish you all the luck in the world. And I hope to see everyone at our next programs coming up. So thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you all for having me.
Yay, Tiffany. Bye.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone.